Escaped Sapiens.
In the first episode of the Escape Sapiens podcast, I speak with Gregg Suaning, who is a biomedical engineer based at the University of Sydney. Gregg worked for Cochlear in the 90s, improving the design of hearing prosthetics, and is now turning his expertise in neurobionics to the much more complicated task of constructing visual prosthetics. Gregg very kindly agreed to sit with me to explain some of the technology behind his work. We discussed the history of neuroprosthetics, about what it's like to be implanted with a hearing device, about the challenges faced in curing blindness, and about the current state of the art. It was a lot of fun to speak with Gregg. I hope you enjoy hearing what he has to say. I last spoke to you, I was a student of yours, so I was an undergrad student of yours in Newcastle, and it would have been 10 or 15 years since I last spoke with you. But even back then, I was really excited about the research you're doing. Back then, it seemed sort of sci-fi to me. And so I'm kind of excited to speak with you and see how things have progressed in the interim. But I thought what might be best is if you started by just explaining in a little bit of detail what neurobionics and neuroprosthetics are before we jump into the specifics of what you're working on.
Sure. Okay. So when I first learned about this, or when I was first learning about it, I thought that the body sort of had something like wires in it that would, say, get the brain to tell the left toe to wiggle or do something. And the whole idea of having, say, a bunch of copper cables in your body isn't too far off. Instead of copper cables, you have these little tubes, more or less, which are associated with nerve cells, and these tubes are called axons, and the axons act like these cables. And when these cables are activated, they send this signal down to, let's say, a muscle, and when it receives that signal, then the muscle contracts. Similarly, if you have vision from your eye to your brain, if you were able to stimulate one of these axons or one of the cells that's associated with the axons, then you can send a signal off to the brain that's perceived like a little point of light or a little spot of light that we call a phosphene. It works in hearing, so you stimulate what's called the spiral ganglion cells, and then you can have hearing sensations. You can do it in the visual system and have visual sensations. You do it in the peripheral nervous system and stimulate muscles and all sorts of body functions. So that's the basis of bionics. You can apply an electrical signal to these things to start start the signal moving towards its destination. But in a sense, it's generic throughout the body. If you want to stimulate a muscle, it's one mechanism. It's the same mechanism for doing that in, let's say, in the optic nerve or in the auditory nerve.
Okay, and you're specifically interested in curing paralysis in people's faces and curing loss of vision and also hearing, right?
That's right. Yeah. So we have lots of different projects that we're working on, but they all seem to have this common neural element to it.
How did you originally get interested in this? Is it for personal reasons? As in, did you have any family members that had paralysis or anything along these lines, or is it just curiosity and sort of the whole physics of the situation that interests you?
My mother used to work for what they called the Blind Society, and she would visit with people that were blind, and she would, when I was younger, she would describe to me how debilitated they were, what their limitations were. But I guess the big inspiration was when I worked at a company called Cochlear, which is in Sydney, and they make auditory devices, so bionic ears, and it was just absolutely fascinating to see how well people would perform with these things, and little kids that would have otherwise been completely deaf and would have probably had to go to a special school, they could. What amazed me the most, and I still hear Australian accents because I'm from the United States, but to have people that were profoundly deaf get this device and be able to hear so well that they, the little nuances of accents. Sometimes you talk to someone and you think, oh, you're from somewhere else, but that's a really subtle bit of speech and hearing, and they can do all that stuff. So it's really remarkable what they can do. So in keeping with what I was saying before, where you have this sort of generic method of stimulating things, vision and hearing and muscles and things like that, I thought we could do something like that for vision. And so taking that cochlear implant sort of approach, where you put electrical impulses into nerve cells and send them off to do something, could be applied for vision. And that's sort of what inspired me to get into this field.
I want to, before jumping into talking about the Bionic Eyes that you're working on, since people are going to be more familiar with the cochlear, I wanted to ask just a few quick questions there, if that's all right.
Sure.
So it was quite a few decades. It was 20 or 30 years ago that you first started at Cochlear, right?
Yeah, 30 years ago.
So how has the technology progressed from when you first started to now? Do we have the devices? Do they have true sound now, or where are we at today, and where did it start?
Yeah, it's interesting how slow things can be with medical devices. So the first cochlear implants were single channel devices. The company that makes Post-it notes, 3M, they were one of the main manufacturers of single channel cochlear implants, and they you could basically tell when there was a noise. So if I'm speaking, basically all the cochlear implant would tell you was buzz, 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 and maybe if you're looking at my mouth moving, you could work out what I was saying, or at least get the gist of what I was saying. They didn't perform very well because it didn't have sort of that dynamic range like a piano. It would be basically punching the same key on the piano time after time after time, and not being able to change it to any other keys. But then in various places around the world, including in Melbourne and in Austria and various other places around the world, they started working with multi-channel cochlear implants, which basically added keys to the keyboard of the piano. And that enabled you to have not just a buzz, but a buzz and a different buzz, and put those sort of sounds together. And that built a platform that you could then use smarts, intelligence, to take a microphone signal that is just a bunch of voltages that go up and down and up and down. What do you do with those things? It was, I guess, what the big quantum leap was. So it went from these single channel devices that just buzzed to multi-channel devices that were just incredible engineering that were put into the ear, but they weren't used to their how they should have been used. There were some really smart guesses on how they should use them, but after quite a number of years of study, they ended up with a particular method of applying the electrical stimulation, and that really changed things. It went from people sort of being able to understand speech. When I first started working for that company, Cochlear, it was really remarkable if someone could speak on the telephone. You would want to talk to them and sort of work out what formula they were using in their head to be able to converse on the phone. But now it's completely normal to do. So we got to that point through this technique called sound processing strategies. But things haven't changed a huge amount since then. Now they've done a lot of work with being able to operate in noise. So if you go to a party and you're trying to use a cochlear implant, I actually know someone that has a cochlear implant, and I'm in my 50s now, and I have trouble hearing in noise myself. But this person that has actually 2 cochlear implants, he could hear absolutely everything. And so he has better hearing than me in certain situations because he has cochlear implants. So we're not quite to the point where music is playable in. Some people do enjoy it, but it's possibly because they remember what the sound was, and their brain fills in the blanks. I kind of doubt that if you heard some new song that it would just be really pleasing to you because of the limitations of the number of, say, the keys on the keyboard.
Maybe some type of techno would sound about the same.
Possibly, yeah. So we're not to that point where it's exactly the same as the hearing that normally hearing people enjoy, but it's amazing actually, what they're able to do. I think if you had the choice of being deaf or not deaf with these devices, the answer for me would be absolutely. You would just get one. There's no question anymore. It used to be in the very early days that you could actually have a question whether or not it's worth it, but it's definitely worth it now, it seems like.
It sounds like, from what you're saying, that actually many of the advances are on the software side. Are there limitations at the level of the surgery, what people can do? I mean, does the surgeon have to connect individual electrodes, or how does it work at that level?
So the implant itself has built in the case of the Australian one, it's built in Sydney. There are 22 channels, or 22 little metal contacts made out of platinum. So those are the equivalent of the keys on the keyboard. And yes, you're exactly right about the software. If I went up to a keyboard and started playing, people would cover their ears and leave the room. But if someone's skilled at doing that, played it, it's pleasurable and it makes sense. So what they've eventually come to be able to do is to have that ability to take that microphone sound and translate it into electrical stimulation. And but it's primarily the software that's making the big differences now. The big technological change that happened in the, I guess, mid to late 1980s was the ability to make these multi-channel devices. Now that platform is built, the platform that goes on, or the additional work on top of it, has primarily been in the software, making the devices more reliable, but not necessarily changing the number of electrodes. And one of the reasons for that is that when you get your electrodes closer and closer together, they sort of stimulate the same nerve cells. So the one next to it stimulates the same one that you're trying to stimulate, and the closer you get, the less difference there is between the two stimulations. So that spacing seems to be just about right, just sort of at the limit that you can deliver right now.
I wanted to ask one thing is, have you witnessed people turning on their hearing for the first time? Have you been able to witness that yourself?
Not in person, but you can have a look on YouTube, and there are lots of people that have recorded it, and it's really emotional and just astonishing sometimes. Particularly babies that have never heard their parents, switch these things on, and all of a sudden they've probably felt the vibrations of their voice, but then all of a sudden they sort of realize, oh, that's the actual sound. And, I think it's probably one of those things where they have a box of tissues on the desk when they're setting it up, and because it's probably everybody uses it, it would be a really life-changing moment when that switches on, I think.
Yeah, I just wonder how it feels for you to know that your research goes directly into helping actual people. I mean, that's very cool in my opinion. It's a nice aspect of what you do.
Yeah, it's actually something I've missed a lot. We used to, when I worked at this company, Cochlear, it was you'd have kids coming in for their tune-ups, if you will, the adjustments of the parameters of their stimulation, and it was really rewarding to see. And then when I left there to go work on vision, the patient sort of connection was what we found is decades away, and so that instant feedback, I guess, we had with cochlear implants, where you could see people benefiting from it directly. That was really quite wonderful. But we're not quite there yet with vision prosthetics yet.
Yeah, it's going to come.
Yeah. Yep.
I wanted to ask, just before jumping onto the talking about eyes, I wanted to ask, on the topic of when people first turn on their prosthetic, is the sound they hear still completely garbled, and their brain has to learn, or how does that work out?
I guess it depends on whether or not you've heard before. If you know what sound is supposed to be like. I sat next to a woman on a train once that had cochlear implants, and it was still when I worked for the company. I pulled out my business card and I showed it to her, and we had this great conversation on a train journey up to the Central Coast, and she was explaining what it was like to have this cochlear implant. And she said, my neighbor, everybody seems to think that they sound like Donald Duck when you turn these things on. She said, my neighbor sounded like Donald Duck, my husband sounded like Donald Duck, my kids sounded like Donald Duck. But all of a sudden, she started to notice that there was a difference between Donald Duck the neighbor and Donald Duck the husband and the kids and whatnot. And eventually, she said they just sort of separated into their own individualness, I guess. And she said now when I hear them, they sound exactly like they sounded before she went deaf. And I just found that amazing. But there's not enough, going back to this keyboard analogy, there aren't enough keys in the keyboard to 22 channels to give that full spectrum of sound. So that's the brain filling in all the gaps and saying, all right, well, that sort of buzzing and popping sound should sound like smooth speech. And so the brain just does that in real time. And I think that she said there is no difference now, in her opinion, to the sound that she heard before and the sound now for speech anyway.
It's on the going back a bit to when you were talking about your friend being able to hear in loud parties better than you. One thing I was curious about is, you could get to the point where this becomes maybe not better than human hearing, but where you have other abilities. So, for example, I know that people in cinemas can dial their implant into, so they're not listening to the speakers, but they're listening to a radio signal. Uh-huh. And I was wondering, could people with hearing aids hear deeper sounds, or could they dial into a police scanner or something along these lines? Are there some benefits?
Yeah, they just started, the company in Sydney, they've just started recently having Bluetooth connections to telephones. So I think they first started with iPhones, and then they moved on to Android phones more recently. And you just have, it's like a Bluetooth headset, but it's built into your head. And you don't have to have any wires connecting between that and your implant. So I think they're already there, so that you can have conversations completely wireless and sounds that no one else can hear.
That's very cool. I guess you could also turn off your your implant if you want to get some sleep, or you don't want to be distracted in an exam or something. So
that's right. Yeah. My
or if someone's annoying.
My wife's grandmother used to have hearing aids, and she said they were the best things ever. She could just switch them off when the grandchildren got really, really loud.
So maybe in the interest of time, we should jump into some of your more recent work in Bionic Eyes. And what I wanted to ask you to start with is, how much more difficult is this as a problem than hearing?
Yeah, it's difficult on a number of levels. So going back again to this keyboard, you have 22 keys on a keyboard with a cochlear implant. If you counted the number of light sensitive cells in your eye, it would be in the millions. And then they sort of converge to around about 1 million cables that go down the optic nerve. And so if you can think about the different sounds in a musical song and try and compress that to 22, it's the same sort of problem with vision. You're going from 1 million to some number, and that some number is limited by engineering ability, the ability to put in an electrode, the ability of the electrical charge to deliver enough current to the nerves, and then that overlapping issue that I was talking about with cochlear implants, where you get the electrodes too close together and then they sort of stimulate the same thing. So I'd say it's a lot different from that technological perspective, but we can still draw upon the lessons learned. So cochlear implants sort of spun out of pacemakers. Pacemakers had to have this electrical circuit inside the body that lasted for a very long time. Cochlear implants took that to the next level, where they made that same sort of thing smaller, but with more channels that come out of the box. And we're doing that again, sort of the next level there. Now that's the technology side. Now the uptake side, where we were talking before about cochlear implants being something that if I went deaf, I would just get one. It wouldn't be a question. With visual prosthetics, I don't know if we're there yet. It's sort of like where cochlear implants were in the very early days, where maybe the technology platform is there, but the method to translate, instead of a microphone, but from a camera into a set of instructions to give to an implant to stimulate things. We're not there yet. We don't really know what that magic code is to convey vision and to be able to make it enjoyable. So if you look at the first generation of visual prosthetics, and there have been people that have been implanted with bionic eyes, they kind of don't enjoy them that much, and because of that, those limitations in the technology, I think, and it could also be that algorithm, the software there could be a breakthrough, like there was in around 1996 in cochlear implants, where it went from not very good to really good very quickly. So we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what that magic formula is, and we don't even know if there is a magic formula. But where things are now is people are trying to develop more channels so that we can manage this crosstalk between the electrodes. Also work on the algorithms to see how best are these things delivered, and trying to understand what people actually want. It's kind of tricky to get volunteers for these projects because of management of expectations. There was a television show in the 1970s called The $6 Million Man, and it had this guy that had a horrible accident, and he got a bionic eye, but he could see perfectly into the next city. It was just completely far-fetched, and people around about that age that might have seen that television program, they might expect that a bionic eye can do that, and it definitely can't at this point in time. Maybe someday, but not yet. So managing those expectations is difficult, and you don't really have a product that people will want to buy unless there's someone raving about it, saying, look at how great this is.
So if expectations were high, does that mean, so in the beginning, did people have high expectations, or did they think you were crazy? Did you get lots of support initially, or?
I think it's such an emotive thing that I didn't have too much trouble talking people into the idea that there was there's some possibility of doing this. A lot of people said, "Oh, don't bother. It's been tried and nobody was able to do it." But yeah, it wasn't so much trying to get people to believe in it. It was actually delivering. It's the hard part, delivering those the potential, I guess, of what you think you should be able to deliver relative to what's possible right now.
So what is the actual device you're building? What could you tell me a little bit about that?
Okay, so it's we call it the Phoenix 99, and Phoenix is something that rises from the ashes. And the reason we think we've risen from the ashes is because of the way that the money comes with research. You get a grant, you run through that grant, you get to where you as far as you possibly can, and then the money stops. You don't lose your funding; it just ends. It's not it's got a finite cycle to it, and then you need to find other mechanisms of funding. So several times throughout the project, we've got to the end of our funding, and you sort of go, "What next?" And then all of a sudden, there's some opportunity that comes up, and it allows you to go to the next stage. So this Phoenix 99 device that we have, it has a number associated with the 99, which means there's 99 electrodes on it. So you can imagine the television or the computer screen that you're looking at right now. What are they? Sort of the very lowest resolution is 640 by 480 pixels. So it's at least a million dots, around a million dots. And when you reduce that to 100, you can imagine what sort of pictures you can convey. Not a lot. Now you can...
Original Mario.
Yeah, maybe. Letters, outlines of doorways, light and dark, which is important for people. So it's not nothing, but it's not everything. And I think people's expectations about everything has to be managed really carefully. But the device, it's a two-part device, and the reason it's a two-part device is because we want to be able to expand it later. So the first part of it is very much like a cochlear implant. It sits behind the ear. It's implanted behind the ear, and it has some electronics in it that receives a radio signal from outside. It also receives its power from outside in the same way that mobile telephones now can have this wireless charging. You just sort of throw it onto a table, and that's using this principle called inductance. And so you get the power across from the inductance, and you can turn on and off that signal to send data through, or you can vary the voltage on that signal to get data through. So that part behind the ear receives instructions. It then works out how much current is the stimulation going to require, and it sends that precise amount of current down two wires that go from behind the ear to the eye, and that current that's sent drives this second implant. The second implant does essentially multiplexing. It will take the signal that comes down this little two-wire cable, and it will say, all right, well, it's telling me that I need to stimulate electrode number 73 with this much current for this long of period. And then it will repeat that and repeat that and repeat that, very much like I'm not quite sure how it works with live video these days, but in the olden days when you had a movie, you would have a frame and then another frame and another frame. And if those frames sort of flashed in front of your face quickly enough, it would look like continuous motion. And that's sort of how we put together the software now. We have pixels that make up the sort of dots inside the frame. The frame itself shows a visual scene, and then the next frame will show how that visual scene has changed since the last frame. And that's how that's our way of structuring the software. Now, it could be that there's a totally different way of structuring that software that is more effective. We just haven't discovered it yet. So this device is...
So what I understand, you have an item in the eye itself, and then something behind the ear, and that eye stimulates the retina?
That's right. Yeah. So the implant that's in the eye has some electronics associated with it, and it has a little cable that goes from the outside of the eye into the sort of beneath the white part of your eye called the sclera. Then underneath the sclera are some bits of tissue that are associated with the retina. There's something called the retinal pigment epithelium. There's the choroid, and there's the neural network that makes up the retina itself. And we're stimulating behind the choroid and going through the choroid and into these nerve cells. And it seems to be fairly effective. Because we're behind this layer that's called the choroid, it means that we're slightly further away than we might like to be with the distance between the electrodes and the nerves that we're trying to stimulate. That has good aspects and bad aspects to it. The good aspect is that if you have something that happens, an electrochemical reaction on the surface of the electrodes, which does take place, then if there's damage to the tissue, you're just damaging blood vessels. You're not damaging neurons. You could go directly into those neurons, but then you run the risk of those electrochemical reactions actually killing off the thing that you're trying to stimulate. Okay. So there's an advantage to being somewhat far away, and the same sort of thing is happening with cochlear implants. They're actually stimulating through a very thin layer of bone that's made out of the cochlea is comprised of, and so they're not directly touching the nerve cells that they're trying to stimulate when they use these things, and so we're using the same sort of principle.
Can I ask where does the signal originate from? Do you need a camera as well, or like the guy from Star Trek, or how does that work?
Yeah, you need a camera to capture the visual scene, because the disease that you might go blind from will kill off this layer of cells inside your eye called the photoreceptors. And the photoreceptors will take photons and translate them into those more or less electrical signals that go off to the brain and are perceived as vision. Everything else works in particular diseases. Retinitis pigmentosa is one of them, and this one that we'll all get if we live long enough called age-related macular degeneration. so it leaves this sort of neural network alive, but the very first layer of it, the photoreceptors, are dead. So what we need to do is bypass those photoreceptive layers and go to other cells that are inside that network. So the two that are of most interest are called the bipolar cells and the retinal ganglion cells. So if we can stimulate either one of those, or a combination of those things, which actually might be better, then you can convey spots of light that are perceptions that people can sort of point out and draw. What does it look like? And they get a piece of paper and they'll actually sketch it out for you. And sometimes it looks like a star in the sky, and sometimes it looks like a blob. Sometimes it looks like a puff of smoke. And managing all that, if you can sort of think about that in terms of what it would sound like, puff of smoke might sound different than a spot of, just a single spot that looks like a star. So in the visual sense, there's a lot of work to be done that sort of controls those perceptions, so that they become meaningful. If you can, going back to the Mario game you're talking about, it's just a bunch of dots, and those dots are configured in a certain way. And if you can configure them in a particular way, then you're all fine. But if you don't have control over those, and the dot on the right is twice the size of the dot on the left, then you don't really get much of an image out of that. Or you have to learn how to make it make sense to you. And that might be the same as that lady on the train I was talking to, where the brain fills in the gaps and figures it all out.
Have you heard of, many years ago, there was research where people would put glasses on to invert their vision, and after living with these glasses for a week, they would be able to deal with it as though they had normal vision, riding bikes, living their daily lives. So there's some evidence, it seems, that your brain should be able to deal with a scrambled image and reconstruct.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to rely on that. And I'm sure that we rely on it with cochlear implants. There's at least some of that happening, probably a huge amount of it happening. With vision, I think it's probably helping even with these early days versions of the implants. I've seen videos of people that have been fitted with these devices, and they're able to sort of sit at a table setting, and they'll be able to pick out where the glass of water is, where the fork is, where the knife is, and that sort of thing. And that's knowledge of what a place setting should look like, augmented by some sort of visual input that you can get from this device. So they're not actually seeing; they're having a combination of seeing, drawing upon their memory, filling in the gaps, and finding their way that way.
It's still very, very cool. One question is I'm guessing the electrodes are much larger than individual color receptors, right? There's going to be no color to this.
Yeah. So if we work out the code for what color is, and I'm sure someone will say they know it, but I don't know if anybody really knows what this code is, because it has to sort of converge down. So you'd have a photoreceptive cell that is say sensitive to blue or green or red or something like that, and it gets activated. It activates another nerve cell that would also be activated by another color photoreceptor, and then it connects to a ganglion cell. And then there are these other cells called horizontal cells and amacrine cells that sort of communicate sideways. And it gets horribly complex on how you would get this signal that is supposed to convey a dot that is yellow or a dot that's blue, relative to like a puff of smoke sort of thing, where it's dark in the middle and light on the outside, and it might be yellow or blue or something like that. We don't have the code, I guess, and someone will figure it out someday, and maybe then we can convey vision. With colors. There have been some hints. There's a company in the United States. I think it's just sort of because of the lack of enthusiasm, I think, for their product. They've sort of gone into hibernation or maybe even out of business. But they would present things at scientific conferences, and at the end of them, they would have these little teasers, a video of one of their patients that would be fitted with a bionic eye, and they would put on a video screen a color, and they somehow would be able to tell you what color it was. Now, it could be that the color blue is 3 flashes instead of 4 flashes, and the color red is 4 flashes instead of 5 flashes, and tricks like that. But eventually, if you get to learn these sort of things, you might just come to know that 4 flashes equals red. And if your brain works quickly enough, it might eventually come to the point where there's no difference between the red that you used to see and the red you see now with the equivalent of 4 flashes. So a whole lot of unlocking of brain power that we could tap into, I think.
So if you were a betting man, is this something you think is coming on the horizon in, if I gave you 50 years, this is something that is going to be unlocked?
I think so. With cochlear implants, the platform that I was talking about, you have a device that just accepts commands. It's sort of like those, sort of like Chromebooks are now. Chromebooks they require connection to the internet, and you have to get all the information from the internet instead of from the actual local machine. So in a sense, those cochlear implants and today's bionic eyes are these sort of dumb terminals. You just tell them what to do, and if you can tell them what to do and they can respond to those instructions, then you have this vast range of things that you could tell it to do. And if you can unlock that code, and someone might do it, and maybe they've already done it with the thing I was talking about with that company in the US, and then I think yes, you could potentially have blue and red and yellow side by side, and be able to have maybe all shades or all colors in the middle somehow conveyed. I don't know the formula. Maybe someone does. Maybe someone will learn it. But I think in 50 years, you probably have something like that.
This must be super exciting for people who are blind hearing about these developments. I wanted to ask, why do you put your implant in the eye? What's the benefit over directly connecting with the visual cortex? For example,
they did some work. A fellow by the name of Giles Brindley in London in the I think it was about 1968 or 9, and he implanted I think it was about 80 electrodes into the visual cortex of a few different patients, and they saw spots of light, and that really set the world on fire when he reported on this stuff. It was probably the first time a sense could be sort of duplicated in an electronic way. But the issue was that if you sort of take your hand, the palm of your hand, and even your fingers, and you sort of put it on the back of your head, that's the whole area of your brain that is dedicated to vision. So you can imagine trying to have high resolution electrodes close together, metallic things over that whole shape. I'm looking at my hand now, and it looks like about 120 millimeters long and about 85 millimeters wide. And if you're going to space them at half a millimeter each, that's a lot of electrodes, a lot of wires to get to places. So it's sort of it's like how a stream ends up into the ocean. If you can tap into the stream, which is at the retina, you can maybe have a lot more control over what's in that stream than the influence you might have in the whole ocean. So if the visual cortex is the ocean, and at certain parts of the retina are the stream, the control is better, we think, at the sort of source, I guess you'd say. Now there are people that are still working on this. In fact, at Monash University in Melbourne, they're working on these things they call tiles that they inject them into the brain tissue, and they've done some work in preclinical studies, and it seems like it's a viable approach to get spots of light. Now we can deliver spots of light along in the retina. We can do it by stimulating the optic nerve. We can go to this area called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and all of these locations along the visual pathway will produce a spot of light. So the production of a spot of light is one thing, using it is another. So I think it's when you're talking about the visual cortex, it's the number of and in the retina to a similar extent, it's the number of spots that you can deliver and how well you can modulate those things, how you can make them go differently than another one.
To be honest, if I was a blind person going through a surgery to restore my vision, I'd prefer having a surgery not on my brain, if possible as well. Could I ask, have there been clinical trials yet with the device you're working
on? Sort of. So we had a very well-funded Australian government project from 2010 until 2015. I think it was about 2008, the government of Australia had a meeting of the minds, and they wanted to work out where the nation of Australia wanted to be scientifically and culturally in the year 2020. So it was called the 2020 Summit. And one of the things that came out of that 2020 Summit was to do something bold, and we had this really remarkable reputation in Australia to be able to make deaf people hear again, and the idea of making blind people see again was very attractive, and we were one of a team of research groups that was that contributed to a human trial, clinical trial that it took place in I think from about 2014 to early 2016, I believe. So there was no implanted electronics in those. It was the electrodes that we talked about before, with the cable that we talked about before, but with all of each individual electrode having its own individual wire, and then it would go to a little plug in the back of someone's head that was actually sticking out through the skin, and you could connect that to electronics in the laboratory. And there were 3 people that were implanted with this. One of them did quite remarkably well. I think all 3 of them, I know all 3 of them could see something. They could see dots. Okay. And but one of them just was able to make sense out of those dots better than the other people. And so that was, it was very encouraging. It was the first time that what we call a suprachoroidal implant, that was what we were working on and still are working on, was demonstrated as being effective in being able to produce these spots of light. And so there's a platform there, and you could modulate the size and do various things with the spots of light. But again, it's like that cochlear implant. They could make a buzz sound. They could make another buzz sound that's different than the other buzz sound. And but it was how you put those things together that was key. So I think we're at the early stages with the platform, but in the absolute infancy of what can be done with the software and how you deliver these things. What's the right code? What's the right sequence of events that takes place?
So the proof of principle is actually there. And so what could this person see? Could they read a large letter? What was the limit?
Yeah, it's very subjective, I think, because the tests that you have are sort of designed to, well, it's not, I'm probably being unfair, but you design a test that you think they're probably going to be able to pass. You wouldn't sort of give them War and Peace and say, what's on page 7.
Yeah, after all, you want funding at the end of the day.
That's right. So if you have a big video screen and you're projecting the letter E, one measure of success could be, can you tell us where the light part of the E is relative to the dark part of the E? And that, at least one of the patients could do that. Now, taking a step back and saying, was it an E? I actually think she could tell that. I think she could tell at least similar characters might look the same. Like an E and an F might look almost identical. But I think she could probably tell the difference between, let's say, an O and a T, or something that's distinctly different, but not the level of detail. Because it was, when I said that there was a cable for each or a wire for each electrode, there were only 20 electrodes.
Right.
Because the next step, which is something that they're working on, it's a separate research group, but something they're working on now is actually connecting cochlear implants to a visual prosthetic. And so they're limited by the number of channels that they can stimulate to 22. So there are only 20 wire or 20 contacts in these electrodes. So you're very limited by the number of contacts that you have, or the number of options that you have in the stimulation.
So did you oversee that particular experiment? Did you need the box of tissues? Was she ecstatic?
I wasn't actually there, so it was done at Melbourne University Royal Victorian Eye and Ear Hospital, with a part of the overall team. So we were in the technology development side of things, and they were in the clinical side of things, and so I wasn't physically present in the room. I met the lady a couple times that did really well. Really nice lady that I believe she was a nurse before. So she had this sort of medical interest in doing this. So it was exciting for us to understand that that we were in this whole concept of this, what we call suprachoroidal stimulation. That was something we worked on for years and years. We were putting it in different locations of the retina, putting it on the top of the retina, trying to detach the retina, put it underneath the retina, but then a Korean surgeon and friend of mine named Jung-Mo Seo at Seoul National University, he came to visit me and said, "Why don't you have a look at this? We've been doing this in rabbits, and we think it's got some promise." So we started studying the suprachoroidal space. So I guess the contribution that we made was pursuit of that as the location that we should stimulate. But the rest of it was, this clinical team in Melbourne.
I realize our time is running out. How much more time do you have, just so I can gauge? Because I've got a couple more questions, but I could also wrap up depending on how you're feeling about things.
Okay. I do have something at 9:30, so I've got 7 more minutes, but I could probably be 5 minutes late to that.
Okay, I'll wrap it into 3 quick questions.
Okay.
So the first thing I wanted to know was, it sounds like for these electrodes you need exposed metal.
Yeah.
So how do you have a device that can survive long term when you've got don't things rust? It seems like a difficult problem.
Yeah. So we've learned a lot over the decades with other medical devices. So the first device that was meant to last for a long time, active device, like electronic device that was meant to last for a long time, is the pacemaker, the cardiac pacemaker. In Australia, they made some really important breakthroughs on being able to keep the electronics viable for a long, long period of time by making a hermetic capsule, like a sealed chamber that the electronics went into. And that was done with titanium and ceramic and silicones and things like that. So we learned that silicone and ceramic and titanium were pretty good materials to use. And then the electrode materials, there's a lot of study that goes on to what sort of metal should you use. Platinum is quite a good electrode material, not necessarily for its electrochemical properties, but for the combination of its electrochemical properties and its ability to live in the body for a very long period of time. So it's not the best electrode that there is, but it's perhaps the best combination of that balance between safety and efficacy and that sort of thing. So we knew going into the Bionic Eye project that platinum, titanium, ceramic, and a few other materials and silicones were really quite good body-wise in those applications, in cardiac applications and cochlear implant applications, etc. So we thought we had a pretty good chance that in the vision area that we'd be able to have those materials sit there. There's also in World War II, there were these planes called the Spitfire, and they had canopies that were made out of something called polymethyl methacrylate, which is people know it as perspex or plexiglass in the U.S. And the pilots would get shot. The canopies would get shot up by the Germans, and little fragments would go into their eyes, and nothing would happen. This polymethyl methacrylate stuff would just float around in there, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The eye is what we call a privileged sight. The brain is another one, and the reason, well, we think evolutionary speaking, that the reason for that is if you get sick, you get an inflammation. Things swell to sort of enhance the recovery process. You break your bone or you hit your arm, it's going to swell up, and that's part of the response to the injury. But if you had this happening in your eyes, you wouldn't be able to see, and if you had it happening in your brain, you wouldn't be able to see. It's actually in your genitalia as well. You wouldn't be able to reproduce. So, evolutionary speaking, you've got these privileged sites in your body, and the eye is one of them. So we seem to be able to get away with a little bit more in the eye than we can in other places. We did a study on how well these electrodes behaved inside the eye for a long period of time, and the histologists, the people that look at the tissue after you finish the experiment, they were looking at it, just kind of finding it a bit remarkable that it was so mild, the response. Basically, you put something foreign in the body, and the body says, no, you can't be there. We're going to destroy you. And if they can't destroy you, what the immune system will do is sort of wrap tissue around that foreign thing, and make it so that they can just sort of live together. And if you ever work with wood, you get a splinter. If you've ever seen that splinter, when it eventually comes out of your finger, it's sort of encapsulated in some tissue. And that's the immune system just saying, well, you don't belong here. I'm going to get rid of you, and then giving up after a while, saying, well, okay, you're stuck in there pretty good. So what I'm going to do is wrap some tissue around you that looks like me. That doesn't happen so much in the eye. It does happen a little bit, but not anywhere to the same extent. So we think we might be able to get away with some other materials in the eye. We just haven't explored a great deal of the other options. So we're taking the conservative option and saying it works well with cochlear implants, works well with pacemakers. Let's not rock the boat. We've got enough problems to solve. Let's use those materials.
It's nice that nature throws you a bone in that regard. Another question along these lines: when children are growing, are they born with their adult-size eye, or is this something where you'll have to wait till later in life for the implant?
No, it's I believe it's the only thing in the body that doesn't change size.
Nature's throwing you bone after bone. This is something that's gonna this.
yeah, and that's been a kind of a big challenge for cochlear implants. And you put this device in when I think they do it as young as 4 months now of age. So as soon as they're diagnosed with hearing impairment, they'll put in a cochlear implant. So the head's going to change in size by probably a factor of maybe 3 or so. So you got to compensate for that. So they have like little flexible cables and things like that will be able to stretch and grow. So we don't have that particular problem, but we also don't have that particular problem because we're treating diseases of degeneration. So most of these people that we would be able to treat have seen at one point in their lifetime, probably into their 40s or so. So implanting children is a whole different thing. And maybe when I should have answered when you asked the question about the visual cortex, it might be that the disease that makes the person go blind, or the injury that makes the person go blind, leaves the visual cortex as the only option. Because if you don't have an optic nerve that works, you can't do anything in the retina and you can't do anything in the optic nerve. You have to go to that higher order center, the visual cortex, and stimulate there.
Is just rushing over some questions in the interest of time. I want to finish on what the future holds a little bit. So, in 10 years, so right now you have devices that are looking at 99 pixels. In 10 years' time, or even at the end of your career, what do you hope to see? What's realistic, and what's the dream?
Yeah. Okay, I think the most realistic thing that's going to happen is something that when this company I worked for, Cochlear in Sydney, was floated onto the share market. There was there's a process when you sell a company or make a company public called due diligence, and we had to explore all the possibilities, or as many possibilities as we could think of how this company might be affected in the future. And in those days, probably around 1997 or something like that, or sorry, 95 or so, stem cells were starting to be the rage. They were starting to say, well, stem cells are going to cure absolutely everything. And so that was a big flag to warn people about. You can say, look, you can invest all your money into this cochlear implant company, but tomorrow someone might come out with this stem cell treatment that actually makes cochlear implants obsolete. I think a lot of us thought that this was a couple years away, and now it's nearly 30 years later, and it hasn't happened. It doesn't look like it's close to happening yet, but we might get there someday. Now, something is actually happening, that is really exciting, and it's genetic therapies for overcoming blindness. Now, I still think that the first person whose vision is restored for certain diseases, retinitis pigmentosa, macular degeneration, etc., will probably be someone with a visual prosthetic, an electrical stimulation system. But looking at crystal ball into the future, I think the future is probably, and how many decades into the future I don't know, but it's probably these genetic therapies where you get an injection. There's a virus that's been modified, very much like the COVID-19 vaccines that have been proposed.
It gets into the cells that you need to be modified, delivers some cargo, and that cargo is in the form of a genetic material, and changes the deteriorating cells into something else that's not deteriorating or becomes light sensitive or something like that. So some really exciting things happening there. And it could be that there's a combination of things, that the electrical stimulation, where you can't get that ultra fine point of stimulation, you stimulate many cells simultaneously. It might be that that's the catalyst or the driving force for these cells to heal. You might be able to put a combination of a visual prosthesis in that does electrical stimulation, and the electrical stimulation itself causes either the release of this genetic material or causes the recovery of these cells to take place. So very speculative, but some really exciting stuff happening with some very, very rare diseases right now that were previously incurable and made people go extremely blind, and they're recovering, and it's really exciting.
That's really cool. I want to just finish off with just a few quick sort of, since I started off saying this is sort of a sci-fi type of research. Back to the cures you're working on, I'm thinking, you could do some really cool things. You could have head cinema, Kopfkino, you'd say in German. If you can read someone's optic nerve, as well as stimulate the optic nerve, then maybe you could record what someone is seeing with their eyes. Infrared vision, seeing more colors, augmented reality, having a clock down in the bottom left of your vision. It seems like there's many cool things that you could, since you want funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the sky's the limit for what you could deliver. You don't need a camera. You could be delivering text, or you could be sending emails, or all sorts of things that you could be doing. Delivering movies, yeah, Kopfkino, and all sorts of stuff. Yeah, if you had a movie that you wanted to convey that bypasses all the incoming electronics, and you could just play your little MP4 and to the implant itself, very much like what they're doing with cochlear implants now with phone calls and other sounds. Yeah.
Escaped Sapiens.